He's taken capitalism by storm. A stupendous piece of work analyzing 200 years of empirical data has questioned the very tenets of capitalism. His basic premise is that in the long run, the return on capital far outstrips the return on growth, and so the rich keep getting richer. His theory is questioned by a lot of people, and so understandably so, he doesn't have too many rich friends. More importantly, a lot of people who like his work, a lot of people who hate his work, but people just can't ignore his work, and that's why he's been called the rock star economist. Thomas Piketty, such a pleasure chatting with you right here at the Times Lit Fest in Mumbai. What took you more by surprise, the phenomenal response to your book or being called a rock star economist?
Well, I think the success of the book shows that there is a strong demand everywhere in the world for some form of democratization of economic knowledge. There are many people all over the world who are tired to hear that this is too complicated for them, that economic and financial issues should be left to a small group of experts, who have built such science that nobody else can understand. And this is a big joke. I think economic and financial issues are not technical issues; they are political issues, and all citizens need to make their opinion. So whether you're from the right, from the left, from the center, I think there's a lot to learn from the historical material that I try to put together in my book, I think in a very accessible way. It's a long book, and I apologize for this, but I think it's very readable, and whatever your political persuasion, the objective is that you can draw your own conclusion about the future.
Right, so this is your first visit since the success of that book, and since 2007, which is when you last visited India. Has India changed?
India has changed a lot, and at the same time, of course, it is still the same country with a particular structure of inequality, with a particular history with inequality, the legacy of the caste system, extreme discrimination against certain groups at the bottom, and at the same time a great democracy. And for me, coming to India is always very enjoyable, and I would like to come more often. And I very much hope that in the future I will do more work on India, which will also require better access to information, and in particular,
which you don't have right now.
Which I don't have right now.
Sure. And I want to come to that, but first let's talk about the big picture, which is inequality in India. Right. Where does India stand?
It's difficult really to compare the level of inequality of India with other countries, but from what we know, India is probably in the highest inequality countries in the world, probably closer to Brazil or South Africa than to Europe, say. Or I think, probably the share of total income going to the top 10% income groups is probably somewhere between 50 and 60%, maybe more than 60%, which will be what you have in a country like South Africa. Maybe a bit less, 50% will be the level of the US. In Europe, it will be 30%, but probably India is closer to, between the US and Brazil and South Africa. The sad part of the story is that we don't really know, because of lack of access to proper information, in particular lack of access to income tax data, which used to exist in India until 2000, but in the past 15 years, strangely enough, there's been a degradation of access to income tax information in India, which I think is very sad, because we need more transparency in a country like India.
But what explains this lack of data? And on data transparency, where does India stand vis-a-vis other countries in the world? How poor are we?
Well, what's a bit sad is that, in a way, in terms of access to income tax data, India today, is closer to China than to democratic countries, and it's sad because, of course, India has a strong democratic tradition, but the truth is that today it's impossible in India to have detailed statistical information on the number of taxpayers, the amount of their income for a number of income brackets, which is all what we would need. We don't need to know the names of the people, but we want to have anonymous information, but detailed statistical information, so that you want to know how many taxpayers had incomes between 1 million rupees and 2 million rupees, 10 million and 20, 50 and 100, including for very high income brackets. You want to know how the number of individuals in these brackets is changing over time, how the total amount of their income is changing over time, so that we better know where has all the growth gone? Because as you know, there is a discrepancy between the very high GDP growth rate that we measure in India and the growth rate that we find in household survey for average consumption, in particular for the bottom half of the country, where we don't see this huge growth rate that you have in the GDP statistics. So you want to better know how the different social groups in India are doing, are benefiting from growth, and I think that's very important in order to adapt the policy to whatever we see. But if we don't see anything, then it's very difficult to have a peaceful, democratic conversation about inequality in India.
So, as an economist, you say you're not against market forces. You believe in market forces, provided there are strong democratic institutions, social institutions, and fiscal institutions. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Do you believe India has them?
Well, no, not completely. I think India does not completely have the democratic, fiscal, educational institution that we need in order to put these powerful market forces into the common interest. I believe in market forces, in private property, but I think that we need these strong institutions, to make sure that all social groups benefit from these forces and from the growth process in a balanced manner. I should also add that in order to have sustained growth in the long run, you also need more equality. The idea that we should wait that we develop more before we care about inequality and redistribution, I think is wrong, because I think after a certain point, you want more equality, more inclusive investment in education, in health, in order to have sustainable growth. Otherwise, some of the limits to growth that we see in India as compared to China, for instance, come from the fact that, in spite of the fact that China is, of course, much less democratic, somehow they were able to design a more inclusive strategy of investment in public infrastructure, education, health, so that the bottom half of the country in China, in a way, is better treated than in India, which is really sad, because this is what democracy is supposed to achieve. So it means that it doesn't work the way it should in India.
Sure, but there is a bit of a paradox as far as India is concerned, because for a decade we were ruled by a party whose economic ideology was more left of center, that believed in this concept of so-called inclusive growth, that believed in entitlements, higher public investments in healthcare, education, which is what you're referring to as well. And yet, after a decade of governance, we saw very little change as far as the transformation of the country was concerned, which is why the electorate voted overwhelmingly against the party and voted in favor of a party that promised faster economic growth. So how do you reconcile this then?
Well, the question is, will the new party deliver? And it's not entirely clear, because sometimes I see a temptation in Indian politics, to go for a conflict of identity between groups, and I don't think that's going to bring more growth and more balanced growth to the country. So, I think India, of course, has a legacy of inequality between groups, between lower caste, higher caste, between the Muslim and the Hindu, which was very difficult to erase and to diminish like this in a few decades. And probably in the first decades after independence, India did not take sufficiently seriously the need to invest in basic education, basic health for the bottom groups of the country, and the system of reservations that has been put in place, was not sufficient to counteract the lack of proper public resources available for the bottom 50% children in this country, the quality of health care to which they have access to, and education to which they have access to, has been insufficient under all governments from all sides of the political spectrum. And this is what the Indian elite, wherever they come from politically, have to face today, and they have to come with this challenge. And I see a lot of skepticism about the efficiency of government and what government can do in this country. And of course, I understand that sometimes the bureaucracy and the government delivery system is not satisfactory. But at the same time, there's no other way than to build more trust and to put more resources into this process. There's no other way. When you have 1% of GDP in the entire public health system in India as compared to 3% of GDP in China, I'm not talking of the 8% or 10% of GDP in Europe, but just if you take the 3% of GDP in China, there's no way you can do the same with 3 times less money. So you need government to be more efficient, but at the same time, you need to put more resources. If you just ask for more efficiency, but without more resources, then there will be more frustration, and then conflict between groups and identity politics, will always be, tempting solution. When politicians, also in my country, in France, when politicians are not able to solve inequality problem or unemployment problem, it's always tempting to blame particular groups, to blame foreign workers or to blame particular social groups. And I think that's a big risk. The biggest risk with inequality in India and everywhere in the world is that when you cannot address it through peaceful means, then the politics of
so are you saying India at this stage, from an economic policy point of view, needs more left of center thinking, needs more investment in infrastructure, healthcare, education, even at the expense of expanding its fiscal deficit? Should you not worry about the fiscal discipline, so to say?
Well, I think the Indian elite at some point will have to pay a bit more tax. And I think to begin with, we have to make the tax system more transparent, and we have to better know what the Indian elite is paying or not paying. And I think, the lack of transparency about the tax system is not the best way to build more trust in government, more trust in the tax administration and other public spending. So I think that's very important. And in the West, it took huge historical shocks for the elite to accept these fiscal and social reforms, which in the end delivered both a more equal society and also more sustainable growth and development. And I very much hope that the Indian elite face their responsibilities without similar shocks, and that they are, in the end, they are smarter than the elites in the West, which it took them a very long time and major shocks to face their responsibilities.
But so you don't think faster growth in itself will help India get out of the inequality trap? Because India is one of the few economies growing at 7.5%, and considering that on a higher, as a base expands as well, given the fact that as we have faster growth, will that not help India get out of the inequality trap? Is that not possible at all?
I think that's not enough. I think the mystery of Indian growth is that you don't see it when you look at the bottom half of the population. You don't see the 7% GDP growth rate when you look at the consumption pattern and the living standards and access to education and health of the bottom half of India. You don't see this very high growth rate, and I think that's part of the problem. Sometimes these growth rates might be a bit exaggerated, and sometimes it's just that you have very unbalanced distribution of growth, and I think this is not sustainable.
You spoke about the Indian elite, but is the Indian rich different from the rich elsewhere, or are they all meant to behave the same way?
Oh yeah, I think in every country, the elites, they don't want to pay, and so in my country, in France, the income tax was created, was finally accepted by the elite in the summer of 1914, and this was not to pay for education. This was to pay to go to war with Germany, and until then, the French elite was saying, we don't need an income tax, we will do that later when we are all very rich. And in the end, it's only after World War I, after World War II, that finally there was a development of the tax system, which was then used to invest more in education, to invest in the health system. Now, was this bad for growth, to reduce inequality? Certainly not. In fact, if anything, this is what contributed to higher growth in the post-war period, the fact that European societies in 1950 were much more equal than what they were in 1910. But this came after very big shock. So it's important to reread and to reconstruct the narratives about development, and to realize that capitalist forces by themselves are not enough to bring sustainable
but just to play the devil's
development.
But just to play the devil's advocate here, the Indian elite pays tax in upwards of 30%, and the failure really has been.
Show me the data.
Yeah, I agree, but the failure has been the government's ability to actually get down to how many people are there in the tax net. So they have not been able to widen the tax net. Isn't that the failure of the administration and not the elite?
Well, it's it's both. I think the elites. You're saying they are already paying a lot of tax, but there's no data. So if there's no data, maybe there's something to hide. I think it's important to be very transparent, and I think the elites which very much contribute to the political game and are part of the political game, and many members of parliament come from the elite or come from political dynasties, and they are in the end they are responsible for the fact that there's not enough transparency in the tax system, in the public administration of this country. So I think it's too easy for the elites to just blame bureaucracy, blame inefficient government, and conclude that it's not possible to put more money because it's very inefficient. I think it's a vicious circle where you have lack of trust of government, so you don't want to put more resources, but because you don't put more resources, and you still have a relatively inefficient government. So the two have to come together, and I think in the end it's not a solution to put your money abroad, which has been a strong temptation of the elite, not only in India, that's happening in other countries as well. But I think in India this is particularly problematic, given the level of poverty, in the bottom half of this country. I think this is not sustainable.
Sure. Since we are talking about the rich, I have to ask you, because you have very provocative views on what the rich are doing right now world over, which is philanthropy, which is diverting a significant portion of their wealth for philanthropic activities. Just the other day, we had Mark Zuckerberg pledge almost his entire wealth for philanthropic activities. You don't believe that's sufficient?
Well, from what I understand, he's going to transfer very gradually his wealth to a vehicle, which in the end will be controlled by himself, by his wife, by his children. So this doesn't look like, to me, if you want to give money in the interest of others, and you want to contribute to the public interest, then you should not control the foundation or the whatever vehicle you choose to create. If you keep the control of the structure, it means you keep the power. That doesn't look too much like philanthropy to me. I think if you should not have, if you want to call it philanthropy, then you should not be chairman of the board, and you should not keep the control of the foundation to which you are transferring the assets. Let me also say that I believe in philanthropy if it at two conditions. First, if it's true philanthropy, so you don't you lose control of the money for good, and you just transfer it to other people, not you, not your family. That's the first condition. Second condition is that philanthropy, this has to come in addition to taxation. It cannot come instead of taxation. I think it's not a good situation when you see, Warren Buffett in the US told us that, he's paying less tax than his secretary. And I think that cannot work this way. And actually, Warren Buffett is asking to pay more tax. So this has to come from the tax system itself, that you want, the people with the highest level of income and wealth to pay in proportion to their income and in proportion to their wealth. They need to pay at least as much as what the middle class is paying. Otherwise, there's a risk that at some point, the middle class, including in Europe or in North America, they don't want to pay anymore. If they feel that people above them, they are paying a lower effective tax rate than what they are paying in the middle, this cannot work. So I think you cannot organize societies where you have thousands of people at the very top, who want to decide by themselves how much they want to contribute to the public good.
Sure. Just a few questions on the broader economy, which is the state of Europe now. We've seen the ECB announce another round of stimulus, clearly indicating that it's still not out of the woods. What's your own sense on the state of the European economy?
I think we have been asking too much to creative monetary policy in Europe and in the US in the past 10 years. So of course, it's very easy to print money, to print billions of dollars, billions of euros, and sometimes that can be very useful because this can be a way to avoid a complete bankruptcy of the financial system and to save banks from a complete financial panic. But there are limits to what you can do by printing money, because you print billions of dollars, euros, but then you put them somewhere and this is going to create some asset price bubbles in a particular sector of the economy, real estate, or some particular part of the stock market. And the people who are going to benefit from this in the end are not necessarily the people you would like to benefit from public policy. So I think we need to ask more to fiscal policy, to budgetary policy. So in the case of Europe, I think we will need to have a common corporate tax. If you have 28 different corporate tax, that's not going to work. This is in the end what makes very large multinationals pay lower effective tax rates than our medium-sized businesses, which makes no sense. So I think we must start with a smaller group of countries within the Eurozone.
Sure. What about the US? When do you see them hiking rates in the Fed, and what impact will that have?
The US, in the US, the problem is different than in Europe, but in the end, the federal political institutions, they are probably less dysfunctional than the European federal institution, which do not work at all, but they are also quite dysfunctional, and partly, for other reasons than in Europe, which have to do with the fact that the political system in the US, to some extent, is captured by a very small, very wealthy elite who basically, don't want to pay for the budget deficit, and this is why we have this situation a little bit like in Europe, where we are asking a lot to creative monetary policy, but this is going to come to an end. We cannot solve all problems just by printing money in order to pay for the public deficit. At some point, we have to agree about a budget, to agree about a tax system, and it's quite frightening to see in the US the fact that now private money has basically no limit in the financing of political parties and political campaigns, and this is something very new, even in the US, where there used to be laws to limit this, and what we see with Donald Trump and what we see with political campaigns in the US today, has a lot to do with this lack of control on the power of private money. So are we going to have a soft landing, a hard landing of monetary policy in the end? It's very difficult to predict, but I'm very concerned about the fact that we have not prepared our economies enough, both in Europe and in the US, to alternative solutions and just more and more money printing.
Very quickly, I have to ask you, what do you think of the Indian central banker? Since we are talking of central banks, what do you think of Raghuram Rajan as an economist and as an academician?
Look, I don't know enough, to comment on this. I'm not here to give lessons to Raghu Rajan or to India in general. Let me simply say that in India, just like in Europe, in the US, there are limits to what we can ask to a central bank. And in the end, it's more complicated to agree on a tax reform, to agree on a new budget, to agree on a new positive discrimination system for access to education by the lower economic groups in society. That's much more complicated than printing money, but in the long run, that's much more important and much more efficient.
My final question to you, how do you deal with your rock star status now? Has life changed, or do you miss your old life anymore?
Most of the time I have a very normal life in Paris, with my family, with my wife, with my 3 daughters. I have a very normal life. I am at my office, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Then I am back home. I see friends. I go to the movie theater a lot. And look, I have no problem with the rockstar status as long as it brings more people to read
your books.
My book and other books as well. I think reading books is important. I think many politicians in France and maybe in India, say that they don't have time to read books, but I think they should find the time. I think it's important to read books, and I think the democratization of economic knowledge in the end, can contribute to the democratization of the economy itself.
Thomas Piketty, such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for this chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.